The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Montana, as Sarah Martinez stepped out of her weathered pickup truck. The small farming town had been her refuge for 3 years now, ever since she'd left everything behind in Phoenix. She pulled her long sleeves down instinctively, covering the network of scars that traced up her arms like a road map of survival. The local diner, Maggie's Place, buzzed with the usual morning crowd, ranchers grabbing coffee before heading to their fields, shop owners discussing the upcoming harvest festival, and teenagers sneaking glances at their phones between bites of pancakes. Sarah had grown comfortable with the routine, finding solace in the predictable rhythms of small-town life. "Morning, Sarah," called out Maggie, the diner's owner, her voice carrying the warmth that had drawn Sarah to this place initially. "The usual. Just coffee today, thanks," Sarah replied, sliding into her regular booth by the window. The vinyl seat had seen better days, patched with duct tape that somehow made it feel more authentic, more real than the sterile environments she'd left behind. As she waited for her coffee, Sarah watched the town come alive through the smudged glass. Mrs. Henderson was opening her flower shop across the street, arranging chrysanthemums in the window display. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant smell of cattle from the surrounding ranches. Her peaceful moment was interrupted by the arrival of the Brennan twins, Jake and Tyler, both 19 and cocky in the way that only small-town football stars could be. They slid into the booth behind her, their voices carrying that particular brand of confidence that came from never having their worldview challenged. "Did you see that new girl working at the hardware store?" Jake's voice cut through the morning chatter. "Pretty face, but man, have you seen her arms? Looks like she went 10 rounds with a cheese grater." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her sleeve, her heart beginning its familiar rapid beat. She'd heard whispers before, caught the sideways glances, but this was the first time someone had been so blunt about it within earshot. "Yeah, what's that about?" Tyler chimed in, his voice equally loud and thoughtless. "Probably some city girl drama. You know how they are." The coffee mug trembled slightly in Sarah's hands as Maggie approached with the steaming cup. The older woman's eyes met Sarah's, and there was a flash of understanding there, a silent communication that said she'd heard it too. "Boys," Maggie said sharply, turning toward the twins' booth, "maybe you should focus on your own breakfast instead of gossiping like old hens." But the damage was done. The familiar weight of shame settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy coat she couldn't remove. She'd moved to Cedar Ridge specifically to escape the stares, the questions, the constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. Here she'd hoped to be just another face in the crowd, another person trying to make a quiet life. The diner suddenly felt too small, too crowded. Sarah left a $5 bill on the table and hurried toward the door, keeping her head down as she passed the twins' booth. She could feel their eyes on her, probably putting 2 and 2 together, realizing they'd been talking about the very person sitting behind them. Outside, the October air bit at her cheeks, but it felt cleaner than the stifling atmosphere inside the diner. Sarah leaned against her truck, taking deep breaths and fighting the urge to drive straight home and hide for the rest of the day. But she had obligations. She worked part-time at Peterson's Hardware, helping with inventory and customer service, and old Mr. Peterson was counting on her to help with the morning delivery. As she drove the short distance to the hardware store, Sarah's mind wandered back to that night 3 years ago. The house fire had started in the early hours of the morning, electrical wiring in the old Phoenix apartment building where she'd been living. She'd made it out alive, but not before pulling 2 of her elderly neighbors from the flames. The burns on her arms and shoulders had healed, but the scars remained, a permanent reminder of the night she'd chosen to run back into danger instead of staying safe. The doctors had called her a hero. The newspapers had run the story with headlines about the Angel of Phoenix. But Sarah had never felt like a hero. She'd felt like someone who'd simply done what anyone would do, what anyone should do. The scars weren't badges of honor to her. They were just reminders of pain, of a life that had been interrupted and forever changed. Peterson's Hardware sat on the corner of Main and Cedar, a brick building that had served the community for over 60 years. The faded sign creaked in the morning breeze, and the familiar smell of sawdust and motor oil greeted Sarah as she unlocked the front door. "Morning, Sarah," Mr. Peterson's voice called from the back office. At 72, Harold Peterson moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades working with his hands. His white hair was always slightly mussed, and his flannel shirts bore the honest stains of a man who wasn't afraid of real work. "Morning, Mr. P," Sarah called back, grateful for the normalcy of his greeting. Harold had never asked about her scars, never stared, never made her feel like anything other than a valued employee and friend. The morning passed quietly, with Sarah helping customers find the right screws for their projects, explaining the differences between various types of paint, and organizing the seasonal display of snow shovels and ice melt. It was simple work, but it grounded her, gave her purpose, without requiring her to reveal more of herself than she was comfortable sharing. Around noon, as she was restocking the gardening section, the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see the Brennan twins entering the store. Her stomach tightened immediately, but she forced herself to stay focused on her task, hoping they were just there for supplies and wouldn't notice her. "Excuse me," Jake's voice came from directly behind her, making her jump slightly. "Do you know where we can find some fence repair kits?" Sarah turned slowly, keeping her expression neutral, despite the anxiety clawing at her chest. Up close, Jake looked younger than his 19 years, his face still carrying the softness of adolescence despite his tall, athletic frame. "Aisle 7, about halfway down on the right," she said quietly, pointing toward the back of the store. "Thanks," Jake said, but he didn't move away immediately. Instead, he studied her face with an intensity that made Sarah want to disappear. "Hey, weren't you at Maggie's this morning? I think you were sitting behind us." Sarah's heart pounded, but she nodded. "I was there, yes." Tyler appeared beside his brother, carrying a bag of concrete mix. "Yeah, that's her," he said, his voice lacking the discretion that the situation called for. "The one with the—" Jake elbowed his brother hard, finally seeming to realize the awkwardness of the situation. "Tyler, shut up." But Tyler was either too dense or too thoughtless to take the hint. "I'm just saying it's pretty intense. Must have been some accident." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite die out. Sarah felt her face flush hot with embarrassment and anger. She'd dealt with curious questions before, but something about Tyler's casual dismissal of her experience, his reduction of her survival to some accident, sparked a flame of indignation she'd been suppressing for years. "It wasn't an accident," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "It was a choice." The twins exchanged glances, clearly not understanding what she meant. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of her long sleeves, the constant need to hide parts of herself from the world. "I need to get back to work," she said finally, turning away from them and walking toward the front counter where Mr. Peterson was helping another customer. As the twins completed their purchase and left the store, Sarah felt the familiar spiral of self-doubt beginning to spin. Maybe she should have stayed in Phoenix, found a way to blend back into the anonymity of city life. Maybe small towns weren't the haven she'd hoped they would be. Maybe there was nowhere she could go where her scars wouldn't tell her story before she was ready to share it. The afternoon dragged by, each customer interaction feeling stilted and uncomfortable. Sarah found herself checking the clock repeatedly, counting down the hours until she could go home to her small rental house on the outskirts of town, where she could roll up her sleeves and tend to her garden without worrying about who might see. As closing time approached, Mr. Peterson noticed her distracted state. "You okay today, Sarah? You seem a little off." Sarah forced a smile. "Just tired, I guess. Maybe I'm coming down with something." Harold studied her with the perceptive eyes of someone who'd raised 3 daughters and knew when something deeper was troubling a person. "You know, Sarah, I've been meaning to tell you, Mrs. Peterson and I are real grateful to have you here. This old place has never run smoother, and you've got a way with the customers that makes this feel like more than just a business. You make it feel like community." The kindness in his words brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. "Thank you, Mr. P. That means more than you know. Whatever's bothering you, just remember, this town's got good people in it. Sometimes the young ones need a little time to grow up, but the heart of this place is solid. Don't let a few thoughtless comments make you forget that." As Sarah locked up the store and walked to her truck, she wondered if Mr. Peterson had somehow overheard the morning's incident, or if he was simply intuitive enough to sense her struggle. Either way, his words provided a small comfort as she drove home through the golden afternoon light, past fields of harvested corn and pastures where cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Her house sat at the end of a gravel road, a modest 2-bedroom ranch that she'd been renting from a family whose children had grown up and moved away. It wasn't much, peeling paint on the shutters, a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle, but it was hers, a place where she could exist without explanation or apology. As she changed into her garden clothes, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bedroom mirror. The scars on her arms looked particularly vivid in the late afternoon light streaming through the window, raised, pink lines that crisscrossed her skin like abstract art painted in survival. She'd grown used to them over the years, but seeing them through the eyes of strangers still had the power to make her feel exposed and vulnerable. Outside, her garden waited, rows of vegetables she'd planted in the spring, now ready for the final harvest before winter set in. Working with her hands in the soil had become a form of meditation for Sarah, a way to connect with something larger than her own struggles. As she pulled the last of the carrots and cut the remaining squash from their vines, she felt some of the day's tension begin to ease. The sun was setting behind the mountains when she heard the rumble of a truck coming up her gravel driveway. Sarah looked up from her garden, wiping dirt from her hands on her jeans, to see an unfamiliar pickup approaching. The truck was old but well-maintained, with the kind of honest dents and scratches that came from years of actual work rather than careless driving. As the truck stopped near her porch, Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. She wasn't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors in rural areas could mean anything from a lost traveler to someone with less innocent intentions. But as the driver's door opened and a tall, weathered man in his 50s stepped out, something about his demeanor immediately put her at ease. "Evening," he called out, tipping his worn baseball cap. "I'm Ben Hartley. I own the ranch about 2 miles down the road. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." Sarah walked toward him, noting the way he kept a respectful distance and maintained eye contact without staring. "I'm Sarah Martinez. What can I do for you, Mr. Hartley?" "Well, I was in town today picking up some supplies, and I heard there might have been some unpleasantness at the diner this morning. I wanted to make sure you were all right." The concern in his voice was genuine, and Sarah found herself surprised by the gesture. "That's very kind of you, but I'm fine. It was just some thoughtless comments from a couple of kids." Ben nodded slowly, his weathered hands resting on his belt buckle. "Sometimes young folks need to learn that words have weight, that there's real people behind the stories they think they know." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with judgment and assumptions. Sarah studied his face, deeply lined from years of outdoor work, with kind eyes that held their own stories of hardship and perseverance. "Would you like some coffee?" she heard herself asking. "I was just about to put a pot on." "That's mighty kind of you, but I don't want to impose. I just wanted to make sure you knew that not everyone in Cedar Ridge thinks like those boys." As Ben turned to leave, Sarah felt an unexpected desire to extend the conversation. There was something about his presence that felt safe, steady, like talking to someone who understood that life could be complicated and painful without needing all the details explained. "Mr. Hartley," she called after him. "The coffee offer stands if you change your mind, and thank you for checking on me. It means more than you know." Ben touched the brim of his hat again. "You have a good evening, Miss Martinez, and remember, some people see scars and think weakness, but folks with any sense know that scars mean you fought something and won." As his truck disappeared down the gravel road, Sarah stood in her garden as darkness settled over the valley. For the first time since the morning's incident, she felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Maybe Mr. Peterson was right about this town having good people in it. Maybe she just needed to be patient enough to find them. In the days following the revelation of her scars, Sarah Martinez found herself at the center of Cedar Ridge's gossip mill. The small town buzzed with whispered theories about her past: car accidents, abusive relationships, gang violence, each version more imaginative than the last, yet none approaching the truth. The comfortable anonymity she had cultivated at Peterson's Hardware began to crumble as regular customers grew awkward around her, some avoiding eye contact while others stared too intently. Mr. Peterson tried to reassure her that the town's attention would eventually shift to other matters, but both knew the damage to their peaceful routine had been done. The real confrontation came Friday afternoon when Sarah found herself alone at the store counter, facing a formidable trio: Beverly Connors, the mayor's wife and self-appointed guardian of community morals, flanked by Janet Mills from the church auxiliary and Carol Thompson from the insurance agency. The women positioned themselves like a tribunal, demanding transparency about Sarah's concerning background. They questioned whether she might have legal troubles or outstanding warrants, suggesting that her scars indicated involvement in violence and that her privacy was suspicious. Beverly insisted that living in a community required openness and that people had a right to know who they were dealing with. Sarah stood her ground, declaring that her past was her own business and that she owed no one an explanation. When Beverly accused her of selfishness and pressed her to reveal what happened, Sarah firmly refused, stating that her scars and story belonged to her alone. The confrontation ended with Beverly's thinly veiled threat that people who couldn't be honest about their past would find it difficult to build a future in Cedar Ridge. When Mr. Peterson returned and learned of the encounter, his gentle demeanor transformed into fierce protectiveness. He denounced the women's behavior and affirmed Sarah's worth as an employee and person, declaring that her past didn't define her present character or abilities. Despite his support, Sarah worried about the consequences his defense might bring to his business. That evening, as Sarah sat on her porch questioning her future in Cedar Ridge, Ben Hartley arrived with coffee and companionship. He shared his own story of arriving in town 15 years earlier as a grieving widower, facing suspicion and curiosity from locals who didn't know what to make of an outsider buying prime ranching land. He explained how time and consistent neighborly behavior had eventually won acceptance. Ben revealed that his wife had died in a drunk driving accident, and how people had pestered him for details, wanting to understand the tragedy for their own peace of mind. He offered Sarah a crucial insight. People don't want your story for your sake, but for theirs, either to feel they can protect themselves from similar fate or to find reasons why you deserved what happened. As he prepared to leave, Ben mentioned the upcoming Harvest Festival, acknowledging that Sarah would face talk and uncomfortable moments, but also encounter many good people simply wanting to enjoy community. He suggested she shouldn't let fear or shame prevent her from living fully, noting that her scars were part of what brought her to this moment and place. His final words challenged Sarah to stop hiding from her scars and start living with them. As his truck disappeared into the darkness, Sarah contemplated the festival as a crossroads, representing both her fears of public exposure and scrutiny, and the possibility of genuine belonging and participation in something larger than her own insecurities. After 3 years of existing in Cedar Ridge's margins, perhaps it was time to stop merely surviving and start truly living. Sarah woke up on a clear Saturday morning, debating whether she should attend Cedar Ridge's Harvest Festival. After changing clothes 3 times, she decided to go, wearing a blue long-sleeved sweater, a small rebellion against her tendency to hide completely. The festival was in full swing when she arrived, with families strolling between decorated booths and children playing with painted faces. Sarah brought tomatoes for the produce display and was warmly welcomed by Mr. Peterson at the hardware store booth, who praised her famous tomatoes. Gradually, Sarah noticed the curious looks she was attracting. Some were merely interested, but others carried the weight of recent gossip about the quiet woman with the mysterious past. Mr. Peterson tried to reassure her with humor, but the moment was interrupted by Beverly Connor's arrival, who made cutting comments about the questions people were still asking about Sarah. The situation escalated when the Brennan twins arrived with friends. Tyler Brennan, loud and overconfident, publicly asked about the girl with all the scars, embarrassing Sarah and drawing the attention of the entire festival. Mr. Peterson reprimanded Tyler, but the damage was done. When Sarah tried to leave, Ben Hartley blocked her path, determined not to let her flee. He confronted Tyler publicly, declaring that Sarah had nothing to be ashamed of. When Tyler persisted with his questions about the scars, Ben defended Sarah passionately, explaining that the scars were marks of someone who survived and deserved respect, not invasive curiosity. Ben's defense inspired other residents. Maggie from the diner, Mr. Peterson, and gradually other neighbors began speaking in Sarah's favor, sharing small acts of kindness she had shown over the years, from helping Mrs. Henderson with supplies to fixing Jim Walsh's grandson's bicycle for free. Beverly Connors remained inflexible, insisting that the community still didn't know what kind of past Sarah was hiding. Faced with continued pressure and inspired by her supporters' defense, Sarah made a courageous decision. "You want to know about my scars?" she said, beginning to roll up her sleeves and revealing the network of pink lines covering her arms. "Fine, I'll tell you." Sarah narrated her story. 3 years ago, she was a social worker in Phoenix, living in an old building. A fire started at 2 in the morning due to faulty wiring. Although she escaped easily via a fire escape, she heard cries for help from 2 elderly people, Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez, trapped on the first floor. "I went back," Sarah said simply. "I went back into the burning building twice, got them both out alive, but not before the ceiling in Mrs. Chen's apartment came down on me." She explained how newspapers called her a hero, but she never felt like one. The media attention became unbearable, so she moved to Cedar Ridge, looking for a place where she could just be a person, not a story. The silence that followed was profound. Beverly Connors looked shocked. Tyler Brennan studied his shoes in shame. Ben reiterated that these were marks of someone who survived, who ran toward danger to help others. The atmosphere changed completely. People approached Sarah with respect and admiration, offering apologies for their previous assumptions. Maggie was the first to gently touch one of Sarah's scars, calling them proof of the kind of person she was. Tyler Brennan eventually apologized sincerely, admitting his words were wrong and that he had never thought of scars as marks of someone who fought and won. Sarah responded gently, distinguishing between being young and being an idiot. Even Beverly Connors approached to apologize, acknowledging she had made dangerous assumptions based on fear. Sarah responded with understanding, explaining that not everyone who carries visible wounds is dangerous. Sometimes they're just trying to heal. After Beverly left, Sarah was alone with Ben, who praised her courage. She admitted it was terrifying, but also liberating. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of her scars, but proud of them. As they walked back to the festival, Sarah noticed how people looked at her differently now, with admiring respect instead of invasive suspicion. At the pie contest, although she didn't win first place, she received warm congratulations. At sunset, Sarah was with Ben and the Petersons, watching the high school band's final performance. Her sleeves were still rolled up, her scars visible, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't thinking about hiding them. Mr. Peterson observed that the town had gotten a little better that day, learning not to judge people by their surfaces and discovering they had a genuine hero living among them. When Sarah protested she wasn't a hero, Ben smiled and said that exactly what made her one. 3 months after the Harvest Festival, Sarah had completely transformed. Her scars were no longer secrets to hide. She displayed them naturally while getting ready for work on a cold January morning. The hardware store where she worked had become a gathering place, where people came not just for purchases, but to talk with Sarah about gardening and share their own struggles and recoveries. The change in Cedar Ridge had been gradual but undeniable. What had begun as a confrontation at the festival had evolved into a deep examination of how the community treated strangers and differences. Sarah had become a trusted confidant, someone whose visible survival made others feel safe to share their invisible struggles. Harold Peterson, her boss, told her about Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez, the elderly couple she had saved from the fire, who were planning to visit her after reading about her support group in the local newspaper. Finding strength in scars had been Ben Hartley's idea. It had started informally in Sarah's living room and grown to become weekly meetings at the community center, attracting people from Cedar Ridge and neighboring towns dealing with various traumas. During the day, Tyler Brennan, no longer the arrogant teenager from before, but now one of her most reliable supporters, brought a concern about his cousin Danny, a war veteran who had been fighting invisible demons since returning from deployment. Tyler asked Sarah for help reaching Danny, who refused to seek traditional help. When Tyler brought Danny to the store, Sarah immediately recognized the signs of someone carrying invisible wounds. Danny, 24 years old, had lost part of his left leg and back in an IED attack in Afghanistan, but his deepest wounds were those that didn't appear in medical records. Sarah showed her own scars without ceremony, creating an instant connection based on mutual understanding of carrying visible evidence of battles fought. That night, Danny attended his first support group meeting, where he met Maria, domestic abuse survivor, James, relearning to walk after an accident, and Linda, burns from house fire. By sharing his story about the night his convoy was attacked, Danny found the kind of understanding that only comes from shared experience. After the meeting, Danny thanked Sarah, acknowledging that talking to people who understood really helped. Sarah explained how she had spent 3 years hiding her story, thinking that making the scars invisible would make the fire never have happened, but that hiding gave the trauma more power than it deserved. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Chen called with news that would change everything. Sarah had won the National Everyday Heroes Award for her community work. The prize included $50,000 and the opportunity to expand the support group model to other communities. Despite her initial instinct to panic, Sarah thought of Danny, Maria, and everyone who could benefit, deciding she was ready to tell her story to a larger audience. The ceremony in New York was surreal. During her acceptance speech, Sarah displayed her scars to hundreds of people, declaring that they were not evidence of damage, but of strength, of choices made in impossible circumstances, of survival that should be celebrated, not hidden. She encouraged other survivors not to be ashamed of their wounds, but to build upon them. 6 months later, Sarah watched the 20th Finding Strength in Scars group begin in an expanded Cedar Ridge Center. The program had grown to 43 communities in 12 states. Danny now helped with organizing, and Tyler was studying social work inspired by Sarah. In the final meeting, Sarah reminded everyone that scars were not signs of weakness, but of survival and strength. Walking with Ben Hartley afterward, she felt a deep peace in living authentically. Her scars, once a source of pain, had become symbols of love, courage, and purpose. When Ben asked if she had regrets, Sarah smiled and said, "Not a single one. These scars brought me exactly where I needed to be,